Thank you for joining us this evening. This is going to be the first part in a 6-part series where me and Joel will be teaching through different issues around justice, race, in the gospel. And before we get into the meat of today, I want to try to set the tone for our discussions that we're going to have here. As a people, and I don't mean Riverview, but as a society, we've lost the ability to talk about difficult things. And because we don't know how to talk about difficult things, when we do have to talk about them, it gets very bloody and mean rather quickly. And that is something I want to avoid as we talk about these issues today, because that's one of the reasons that prevents us from talking about them, because we don't know how to talk about them well. Now, that does not mean that you shouldn't ask tough questions. If you've been in my Sunday school class, you know that I actually prefer tough questions. So if you have tough questions throughout this seminar series, I want you to ask them. It's just remember how we're asking and how we're dialoguing is very important to this discussion. So when we talk about Christianity and social justice, we have to deal with the tough issues. If we don't, we're not going to make any ground. And I think that's why in our society as a whole, we've been spinning our wheels so much, because we don't know how to disagree with someone, to disagree with them passionately, in principle, and not be jerks about it, and not think that we have to hate anybody we disagree with. All right, so again, if you've been in my Sunday school class for any amount of time, you know that I'm very comfortable disagreeing with people. And I don't hate you if I do. And hopefully you can return the favor to me if you end up disagreeing with me. Okay, so having said all of that, let's buckle down here and have that discussion. Okay, this message is titled Christianity or Social Justice. And I titled it this based off of a lecture given by a Christian man that became a book. And his name is J. Gresham Machen. Machen's book was titled Christianity and Liberalism, but the lecture he gave at Princeton Seminary back in the day, this is in the early 1900s, was titled Christianity or Liberalism. He renamed it when it was a book to and. I'm not exactly sure why, but when he was talking about liberalism here, he is not talking about it in the same way that you and I generally talk about it. When we say liberal, we're generally talking politics. For him, liberalism here was theological liberalism. That is liberalism that came into the church and the Christian beliefs and started to erode away those beliefs. And the thesis of his book is that liberal Christianity is really a new religion. Right? It uses the term Christian. It talks about Jesus. It talks about the resurrection. It talks about God. But it has redefined all of those terms to mean something completely different. And in doing so, as he traces this out throughout his books, traditional Christianity believed this, liberal about Jesus, that he is fully God and fully man. Liberal Christianity denied that Jesus was God, but they still wanted to call themselves Christians. But they were, in any historical sense, not Christian anymore. And this is really one of the key things that liberalism, whether you're talking now theologically or politically, does. It redefines terms. It changes terms to mean what it wants it to mean, and oftentimes in a rather sloppy way, to confuse, to redirect, to set the agenda for the discussion. And we are going to see that. Why I named it this is because you're going to see that same issue here with social justice. If we don't take the time to define our terms, you're going to just talk past one another. Right? One person is going to use justice in this way, another person is going to use it in that way, and you're never going to have any meaningful dialogue because you're talking about completely different things. So that is what I'm going to aim to do today. We're going to talk, if you know me, we're going to talk a lot about the Bible, because as a pastor, and this should be true as you guys as Christians too, the Bible is our chief authority. It's where we start our discussion. It's the final appeals court, and we want to constantly revolve around what the Bible is saying about these issues. If we're not doing that, then we're no different than any other group out there on any side of the issue. But in talking about these things, we're going to talk about what the Bible says. We're going to spend some time defining terms, because again, we need to do that to understand it. And then we're going to make some applications at the end to why this is so important. Now, in his book, Christianity and Liberalism, Machen, in the first page or so, wrote this. He says, Light may seem at times to be an impertinent intruder, but it is always beneficial in the end. The type of religion which rejoices in the pious sound of traditional phrases, regardless of their meanings, or shrinks from controversial matters, will never stand amid the shocks of life. This could be my life passage right here. We have done a poor job in the church of, just like I just said, we don't know how we shrink back from these controversial matters. I will tell you that your pastors here, and this is not to brag on your pastors, but we are weird. All right, we are an odd breed. Most pastors I interact with shrink back from any controversy whatsoever. Churches are adverse to controversy and possibly offending someone and losing them. But if you study your New Testament at all, that's the exact opposite of how the apostles and Jesus function. Right? Avoiding controversies does not prevent controversies from originally coming. And Machen knew this. So he wrote in such a way as to shed light on this so we can see things clearly, because by seeing these things clearly, we can then handle them as Christians. And Machen was 100% correct on this, as he was a Presbyterian at the time. Eventually went and founded Westminster Seminary, left Princeton Seminary, because the Presbyterians, the mainline Presbyterians, left the faith. And we can say that to today, those denominations which Machen spoke to are those denominations now which are dead. They're dead and dying. They pretty much don't exist anymore, or they're on life support. Because if you leave the Christian faith behind, Jesus tells you in Revelation 2 and 3, he's going to take your candle, he's going to put it out. You don't get to do that. You don't get to bear the name of Christ and do whatever you want to do. So we want to be really, really careful here as we talk about these things. So social justice, you know this, I know this, it is all the rage right now. You can't go anywhere, you can't even watch sporting events without this agenda being pushed upon you. From grade schools to universities, it's in the curriculums, your kids or grandkids, they're being taught it in schools. It's growing, and this is very true here, it's growing in popularity in the church, even within the NAB denomination. It is being promoted and put forward as a good. And this is one of the powerful things about redefining terms, right? Nobody actually wants to be against justice. Anybody in here want to be against justice? No, I don't, right? It's the same thing like when politicians name their bills that get passed. I'll give you one from each side of the aisle. The Patriot Act. The Patriot Act. Well, no one wants to be unpatriotic. But there are some things in that Patriot Act that took away constitutional rights of Americans. Not so good. The Affordable Care Act by Barack Obama. Not so affordable at all. But it always sounds good, but the substance, no, not so much. And it's really the same thing with social justice. Does Levi want to be someone who's against justice? Most certainly not. And we are told again and again in the church that to be social justice is to be good. So I'll give you two examples here. You might have trouble seeing these from where you are. I took these pictures, screenshots from my phone. This one on the left here is from Relevant Magazine. It's a Christian magazine, and the title is, Yes, the Bible is a Call to Social Justice. All right, so his argument here is the Bible is pushing forward for you, that it is telling you you must pursue social justice. Timothy Keller, who's been jokingly referred to as the Pope, the evangelical Pope, as it were. He wrote a book called Generous Justice, How God's Grace Makes Us Just. And basically, it's a treatise of his on arguing for social justice. Here you can see at the bottom it says, people want justice, so you should read Tim Keller's book on justice. And he's going to give you this wonderful biblical understanding of what social justice is in the Bible. Now, I have read that book, and I've done a chapter-by-chapter review of it on my blog. And I've not engaged with Keller a lot. I have not read a lot of his books. A lot of people I respect a lot really, really like Keller. But this book is really bad. Like I went through it chapter by chapter, and with a microscope, admittedly, but whenever he would put a Bible citation, I would go look it up. And some of them are so blatantly taken out of context. It was hard for me to leave with much respect left for him after that. I'm trying to be generous here, but there was some very bad gymnastics and bad interpretation that went on in this book repeatedly that just left me scratching my head on more than one occasion. But this is just a small sampling here of the Christian push towards social justice. So in order to understand this, I want to start with what is the slogan within the Christian church on social justice. That's Micah 6:8. Okay, Micah 6:8, that is the slogan. It is the proof text verse put forward by Christians who say, see, the Bible teaches you, as Christians, to care about social justice. Okay, let's have a discussion about the Bible. Levi's always game for that. Let's go look at the passage and let's see what it actually teaches. And Tim Keller does this in his book. And the reason why I'm picking on Keller here is because he is a respected individual. Right? He's not some theological extremist boogeyman out there. Okay? He is, by all accounts, as I said, in just about all of his other books, really, really good, really, really solid, and a person you should read. Okay? So I'm not just picking from some fringe over here. I found some troll on the internet somewhere and said, hey, let me show you how bad it is. This is mainline, popular stuff that a lot of churches are endorsing. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and open up to Micah 6:8. We're going to spend some time here. Because again, if you ever get into a discussion with another Christian about social justice, inevitably the concept of doing justice is going to come up. And that comes straight from Micah 6:8. I'll read to you here from the King James Version. And I do that for a reason, because I think the King James Version sets the tone for a lot of how a lot of the other translations have chosen to interpret this, or to translate this passage. All right, he, that's God, hath showed thee, O man, what is good. And what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. All right, so what does God require of you, O man? All right, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. I'm sure you've all heard it. I'm sure you all know it. And if you do any diving into the social justice within the church, you will see it cited up and down, left and right, never questioned. This is the proof text. This is the slogan. This is the banner that they rally under. And we have to ask ourselves this question when you look at that passage: what does it mean to actually do justice? Okay? What does it mean? I'll give you a few quotes here from individuals explaining to us what does it mean to do justice. This comes from Jared Kennedy. He published an article on the website for the ERLC. The ERLC is the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. It is the political lobbying arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention is the biggest Protestant convention or denomination in the United States. This is what he says: the just life God requires from us is humble and shows merciful compassion to others. Okay, so Jared Kennedy is telling you that Micah 6:8, he's referencing Micah 6:8 here, is about you being humble and showing mercy and compassion to others. I want to just say something very plainly here. I have no problem with anybody ever showing mercy or compassion to others. Those are good Christian virtues. All right, Tim Keller, in his book Generous Justice, he says this. He says, the text says to do justice and love mercy, which seem at first glance to be two different things, but they aren't. Okay? Matt Chandler down at the Village Church in Texas, he says something very similar to this. He says these three commands are really one command, do justice, that is then defined with the next two phrases: to practice kindness is the translation he was using, or to do mercy, or to love mercy, and then to walk humbly. Okay, so in these definitions, I want you to note several things here in these definitions. One, doing justice here is horizontally focused. It's between us as humans. Okay? And this justice is necessarily defined as including mercy. To be just, you have to be merciful. To practice justice, you have to also practice mercy. Do not miss this, right, because this is really, really important to what is about to follow. Because as I said at the beginning, central to the Christian social justice movement is a redefinition of that term justice. Okay? And that redefinition of that term justice is that justice is merciful. All right? Think really carefully about that. Justice is merciful. So when a guy stands before a judge and he pleads for mercy instead of justice, where is that distinction? If Tim Keller and company are right, there's really not much of a distinction to be had there at all. Moreover, they say that this is what God requires of you and that it is an imperative. That is, you have to do this. It's a command. All right? And Keller explains in his book, all right, that this justice, why he calls this justice, when he'll say things like caring for the poor, giving to charity, all of these things that are good things, but why he says he has to call this justice is because he thinks the terms charity and mercy are too weak. He needs something stronger, so he uses the term justice, and because that makes it a requirement, something you must do. In fact, this is how his book ends. Okay, so this has just smacked me upside the head when I finished reading this. All right, a life poured out in doing justice for the poor is the inevitable, right, the inevitable sign of any, that is all, true gospel faith. Now, I understand as a preacher and a writer that sometimes you like to end with a good old punch, right? A definite landing spot. But a fair reading of this statement is that if you don't believe that this is what doing justice is, then you're denying the inevitable sign of true faith in the gospel. That makes this a big deal, okay? Because if Keller is right, then everything I'm going to say afterwards is me basically denying the true gospel faith. I think if I sat down and talked with him, he'd back down on that claim a little bit, but that's what he wrote in his book. Okay, word for word quote. So how should we understand Micah 6:8 in context here? Okay, because that's really the important. Is this what Micah 6:8 is doing? Right? Is it redefining justice to including mercy? And is it primarily about interpersonal, horizontal relationships? Well, Micah as a book is set as a courtroom drama. Right? There are speeches after speeches in which God, through the prophet Micah, is bringing his charges against Israel. Okay? He's telling Israel what they have done wrong, specifically in context to the covenant, especially in chapter 6. Here's a little note from the ESV Study Bible on this. Micah writes, in order to bring God's lawsuit against his people, 3:8, he indicts Samaria and Jerusalem for their sins, and both Assyria and Babylon are looming as instruments of the divine sentence. Okay, so they come forward, Micah comes forward pretty much as a lawyer, saying, here are the charges against you, O Israel, for breaking your covenant. That's the context of this book. It is primarily a conflict between the people of Israel and God. Okay? That's where the dispute lays. And here's an outline of Micah 6, the chapter up to this point. So if you have your Bibles open. In the first two verses, God calls creation forward as a witness. He says, all right, creation is going to be my witness here as I bring the charges against you, Israel. Okay? So creation is going to be my witness. The Lord then, in verse 3, interrogates his people. He questions them on the stand for what they have been doing, and then he explains to them his continued faithfulness, pointing all the way back to the Exodus. Okay. Let me tell you about how I have kept the covenant, how I have been faithful throughout all of this. And then he turns to them and he says, okay, implying that they've been unfaithful, I don't care about your sacrifices. Why don't I care about your sacrifices? Because you're not keeping the rest of the covenant. You can't just go forward and present to me all these sacrifices while you're also worshiping false gods and idols. That's not going to cover you. That's God's point here. And then, in verse 8, God offers his demand, his solution. Okay? What does the Lord require of you? In light of this case I have against you, what does the Lord require of you, O Israel? So it's not too much for me to say that Micah 6:8 in context is all about the covenant. It's all about the covenant between God and Israel. It is primarily directed at Israel's vertical relationship with God. Right? That includes entailments of horizontal relationships. But the primary thing in tension and dispute in this passage is not me treating other individuals with justice, compassion, and walking humbly with you guys. It is primarily God telling Israel that they, in their relationship with Him, they need to practice justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And the goal to all of this is a restoration of the covenant, right? That Israel and God would be reunited. And I started you guys with a copy, or with a translation from the King James Version. And I don't mean to pick on the King James Version. It is the most historically significant English translation to have ever existed, and that ever will exist. But because of it, because of that reality, a lot of translation committees are slow to go away from things the King James did in their translations, especially the more popular a verse is. And Micah 6:8 is a very popular verse. So I want to show you some of the translations here of this passage, because it'll help illuminate some of the issues we're having here. All right? So there's the King James Version. Specifically, I want you to focus on the idea of mercy. Okay? So in the King James Version, so the Hebrew word here is hesed. Okay, the Hebrew word is hesed. There's just one word, there's not two. It's not love and mercy. It's one word. It's hesed in the King James Version. In the New American Standard, it is to love kindness, and they have a footnote there. So they put a footnote on that word, and they say it could mean actually to love loyalty. Now, when a Bible translation committee puts a footnote there and gives you a separate translation, that means there's significant grounds for them to tell you that they might be wrong here. And I'll tell you they are wrong. All right? And then the ESV does the same thing. It says love kindness, as the NASB does. And then they put a footnote there and they say, well, it could be steadfast love. Okay, so why does all of this matter? It matters because the word hesed is one word, and it is a very special word in the Old Testament. All right, the word hesed, or if you get a little more guttural, sometimes they put a C in front of it, chesed, all right, is a special word in the Old Testament because it speaks of God's covenant faithfulness, His covenantal faithfulness with Israel. So you can think about some of the Psalms that go, His steadfast love endures forever, or His loving kindness goes forever. The loving kindness, steadfast love, that is hesed. That's the word hesed, over and over again. In the Old Testament, that word has special and unique meaning. So John Frame, in his book, The Doctrine of God, says this about the word hesed. He said, hesed refers to this covenant loyalty in Scripture, both in covenants on the human level and covenants between God and man. But hesed also refers to God's covenant loyalty, the commitment of the Lord of the covenant relationship. Okay? That word that they're having so much trouble in these different translations translating for you is one of the most important words in the entire Old Testament, because it describes God's covenantal love and loyalty to Israel. And in response to that, it's supposed to also describe our covenantal love and loyalty to God. Okay? Michael Shepard, in his commentary on this book, says this about it. To love or choose covenant loyalty, hesed, is often mistranslated as to love, as in have strong feelings for mercy. So Michael Shepard, going over all of this, he says, they've got this completely wrong. This word has nothing to do with mercy. It has nothing to do with kindness. It is primarily about covenantal loyalty. That's what the word means. Now, if you remember the context we just talked about, what's going on here? God is bringing Israel to trial for breaking the covenant. And He says to them, what do I require of you? Do justice, keep the covenant, and walk with me. Okay? There is one translation who gets this right. The Christian Standard Bible says this, translates it this way. Mankind, He has told each of you what is good and what it is the Lord requires of you, to act justly, to love faithfulness, that is hesed, and to walk humbly with God. Now, again, if this is what it means, and it is, okay, that changes the entire meaning of this passage. Right? If it's about loving mercy, like Keller and everybody else who wants to make this about social justice. They might be able to make a case, but it's not. You take out that word mercy, and you understand that the Hebrew word is hesed, and it's about covenantal faithfulness. It's got absolutely nothing to do with social justice. And any pastor, preacher worth his salt needs to stop saying that it does. And you guys too. Right? It's just one of those, I have found that the more popular a verse becomes, the more often it's misunderstood and used to promote things that just aren't true. And Micah 6:8, it ain't that. It ain't about social justice at all. So it's not about, as I said, it's not about mercy, it's about covenantal faithfulness. And you should note too, that at the beginning of that statement, it says, "Oh man, what has the Lord required of you?" He's told you. He's told you. In other words, what Micah says right after that is a citation. So if you have your Bible open and it has a cross-reference section in it, you'll look and you'll see that Micah 6:8 is actually a citation of Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 through 13. The Lord has told you already, Israel, what he wants from you. Back in Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law. Well, what did he tell them back in Deuteronomy? And now, Israel, what does the Lord require of you? Oh, what? I wonder what that's about. But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all his heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. That's what the passage is about. It's about keeping the covenant with God. So my not so biased opinion on this is there are absolutely none, zero, zilch, nothing, no grounds to redefine justice to include mercy in this passage. And that's how Tim Keller starts and ends his book, building it on this house of cards, as it were. And it's just, you need to do better. You really, really do. You know, as I said, I like to talk about the Bible a lot because, hey, that's what we do here. The Bible is our final authority. But I want to shift gears here just quickly and to talk about defining what is actual social justice. What does that term mean? Before we do that, anybody want to throw some tomatoes at me? Ask any questions? Yeah, Matt.
So what about verses like Isaiah 1:17, where it ties justice to defending the oppressed? And it's very clear there that that's a horizontal relationship.
Yeah. Perfect. That's a great question. So what does it mean when Isaiah talks about, you said 1, right? 1:17 and defending the oppressed. That is definitely an act of justice. How could it not be? So defending the oppressed, and this is where we get into we'll get into the definitions here a little bit more. But if you bring into that verse an understanding that the oppressed, okay, that's the wrong word. The biblical definition of oppression needs to be the guardian or the backbone of what that means. Right? If anybody is being oppressed, actual oppression, as the Bible defines it, justice demands us to do something about it. That's what justice is. It rights wrongs. Okay? So when you look at this, and this is what happens a lot in the social justice discussion, it'll say, defend the widow and the orphan in their cause in court. Of course that's justice. Right? But that's not being merciful. That's defending God's definition of what is just. And we'll work that definition out more here after we talk about social justice here. But yeah, the question then is, how do we define justice and oppression? Because there is a vein out there that defines oppression as just if you are poor or if you are this, then you are automatically oppressed. And it's very clear in the Bible that that's not the way. Right? There are the righteous poor, there are the unrighteous poor, the sloth and the sluggard in Proverbs, who are poor as an act of justice by God. That's not all poor people, but it is some. So the Bible doesn't paint this picture that everybody in this class is necessarily oppressed. So when the prophets speak about an instance like that, they're talking about when somebody is actually oppressing the poor or the vulnerable, and because they can't fight back for themselves, righteous and just individuals should stand up for them. And I don't know any Christian teacher who's against that, and if they are, you shouldn't listen to them.
By necessity, justice has to be horizontal, right? We can't do justice to God. Right? God is justice. There's nothing I can do to be just to God. So by definition, justice, to do justice, has to be something horizontal, isn't it?
No, it's not. Okay, and I'll give you the sneak peek at the biblical definition of justice. The biblical definition of justice is giving someone their due. So we can act in justice to God by giving him his due, what he has earned. It is giving him his due. So when he says to Israel, do justice, and then he points back to the covenant and said, you agreed to this. You have committed an injustice by breaking the terms of this contract, which basically what a covenant is, a higher form of a contract. Right? So Israel owes God something, his due, and they've refused to give it. So there are ways in which we can execute justice like that, but not like punitive justice. We can't punish God for doing something wrong because God doesn't do anything wrong. So I think that's probably what you mean by not doing justice to God. Yeah. All right, so defining social justice. All right, this is not easy. Okay, this term is very squishy, and it's very ill-defined, and I think that's on purpose. Okay, because once you define something, then you have to defend the proposition, or the preposition there, right? Once I tell you what I mean by something, if I just start using terms, we've run into this a lot in ministry circles, we'll use the latest catchword, missional this, missional that. You say, what is that? And no one can give you a definition, because then you actually have to, it's concrete then, and you have to defend it, and that's what you see with social justice. It's a very squishy term, and that allows in debates there to be this flexibility, and we never make any progress. And it should be noted that the term social justice was formed, I think in the early 1900s, or maybe the late 1800s, by Catholics. Okay, they've used it to refer to some of this merciful charity work that they were doing. It has since been picked up, and it doesn't really mean that in modern parlance today. So here's a definition I found, Oxford / Yahoo, as it were. Justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. Okay, what is social justice according to them? Well, it's justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. Now, even that, you could take that in several different ways. Right? How do you distribute? Right? Does this distribution mean that everybody gets the exact same things, or is this distribution based upon merit? Right? This definition doesn't actually help us that much, but I think with what we know about how the movement flows, I think we know what they mean by it, but it doesn't actually say that here. Here's a quote from the American Sociological Review on it. As I see it, social justice requires resource equity, fairness, and respect for diversity, as well as the eradication of existing forms of social oppression. Okay. In here. There's a lot in here that you and I would agree with, depending upon how you define those terms. But I do want you to note the term equity here, because I think that's really one of the main things that distinguishes social justice from other things. So this author goes on to describe this. All right, equity is about each of us getting what we need in order to survive or succeed. Access to opportunity, networks, resources, and supports based on where we are and where we want to go. Okay, so equity is getting what you need based on where you are. Okay? Those are the qualifications or the merits. Here's a quote, definition here from the United States government on this and social justice. Equity, it says, is often conflated with the term equality, which means sameness and assumes incorrectly that we all have equal access, treatment, and outcomes. In fact, true equity implies that an individual may need to experience or receive something different, not equal, in order to maintain fairness and access. Okay, so equity, equality, or in the social justice discussions here, equality is generally used in such a way as to refer to you being treated equally. Equity is generally referred to making sure that there are fair outcomes. And by fair outcomes, I mean equal outcomes. That you get the same outcome for everybody. That's generally what the term equity means. And if you're thinking carefully about this, that actually puts equity and equality at odds with one another. Because equality says treat everyone the same, outcomes are whatever happens. Equity says treat people based on where they are and what they need, that is, aka differently, to get equal outcome. The two aren't the same, right? They're at conflict with one another. Okay? So, as I just said there, it therefore, right, social justice, as it's used in modern society outside of the church here, demands unequal treatment. You may think I'm making this up, okay? But I'm not. It is all over their literature that what they are aiming for is equal outcome. And the assumption then is if there is an unequal outcome, then there is necessarily an injustice behind that. So you see stats thrown out all the time. All the time. This percentage of this population does this and this percentage of this population. Clearly that's a sign of systemic injustice. It could be, but it's not necessarily. Right? It could be. So, for example, this is one that's not normally used by social justice advocates. The prison population of the United States of America is around 93% male. Does that mean that the system is systemically injustice against men? It could, but I'm going to go with a no on that. Right? It's a 50-50 population split, but the prison population isn't that way because there are other factors you have to consider. Right? And let's just be honest, men and women are different, and men are more aggressive than women and more likely to commit violent crimes. Right? So back to this idea though. Okay, so social justice demands this unequal treatment. And I'll give you an example here from real life going on right now. The California legislature votes to strike the state shall not discriminate from the Constitution, opening the door to legalize discrimination. So there's a Proposition 209, California. I can't remember, I think it was the 90s. It was passed as a constitutional amendment. All right? It was passed saying that the government and the schools and whatnot could not discriminate based upon sex, race, religion, and all that. Right now there's a strong push in California, because it's always California, to get rid of that. Now if you were to just read that in isolation, you would probably think that there's some far-right group out there of white supremacists trying to get rid of this. It's the exact opposite. Okay, so here's a tweet from the lady kind of running this. Thank you for your leadership. California voters will now have a chance to repeal Proposition 209 and advance true racial and gender equity in the state. I'm proud to have it supported. So they want to repeal so the government can't discriminate on you to get to equity. So basically what they're saying is they want the California government and its schools to be able to discriminate based upon your race and your religion and your sex so that they can have more equity. In other words, if you're a majority culture or majority religion or majority, they want to target you so you can't get hired so they can have more equity. They are arguing, they don't lie about this, they put it in plain black and white if you're paying attention, that true justice demands that we can discriminate to get the equal outcome that we want. Okay, this is how the term is used in much of general society. This is what is taught in college universities and whatnot, and this is a form of critical theory or cultural Marxism. I won't spend too much time defining that for you, but basically critical theory or cultural Marxism views everything in the terms of oppressor versus oppressed. Right? Everything is analyzed through this grid work of things that are, you're either an oppressor or an oppressed. Okay? And critical theory originated from the Frankfurt School, also known as that cultural or neo-Marxism. And traditional Marxism or communism was mainly economic. Right? When that failed, because it failed and it failed miserably, A bunch of communists got together at the Frankfurt School in Germany, and they said, why did it fail? Well, they said, well, what we need to do is to take Marxism and not just have it be about economics, but apply it to cultural issues. That's where the term cultural Marxism comes from. We're going to take the Marxist framework, and we are going to apply it to cultural issues. All right, the oppressor versus the oppressed. And this is pretty much coloring all of our social dialogue right now. Is we think of everything through oppressor and oppressed terms. So, getting to Matt's question, there is a real thing as oppression. And the Bible is 100% against it, and Christians should be 100% against it. But we have to understand when we read our Bible, when the Bible talks about oppression, it is not importing this definition. Right? It's not importing. You can't take the modern concept of oppression, plop it down in a book that was written, 1,000 years before these new definitions came around and say they're one for one. They're just not. Okay? So some of you have probably heard of this book, White Fragility. Why it's hard for white people to talk about racism by Robin DiAngelo. In the aftermath of the tragedy of George Floyd being killed, this became the bestseller. Right? And she's been hired by many companies to come in and speak about this idea of white fragility. I'm not going to talk to you about this book, but I want you to know this because you've probably seen this out there, right? But she's written another book. Okay, she and somebody else wrote this book, Is Everyone Really Equal? An Introduction to the Key Concepts in Social Justice Education. Okay. Same lady, okay, Robin DiAngelo. And this is what she says about it. She says, our analysis of social justice is based on a school of thought known as critical theory, what I just told you about. Critical theory refers to a body of scholarship and is a tradition that emerged in the early part of the 20th century from a group of scholars at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. All right, and she goes on and says some more stuff. A critical approach to social justice refers to specific theoretical perspectives that recognize that society is stratified, that is, divided and unequal, in significant and far-reaching ways along social group lines that include race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. Critical social justice recognizes that inequality as deeply embedded in the fabric of society, i.e. structural, and actively seeks to change this. The definition we apply is rooted in a critical theological approach. Okay, all that to say, and again, if you read the leading thinkers in this, the one everybody's hiring, the one everybody's reading, she tells you point blank that she's a Marxist. She doesn't hide it. They don't hide it in their literature. Right, and if you do any amount of research into Karl Marx, what he believed, how wickedly he lived his life, how much he hated Christianity, and how much millions and hundreds of millions of lives that were unjustly killed by his political philosophy. It is Antichrist. He's not the Antichrist, but it is the spirit of the Antichrist. There's no other way to put it. It is thoroughly and totally unredeemable. Does that mean he gets everything wrong? No. There were people back then who are definitely being oppressed. There are people today who are still being oppressed. But his solution is hell on earth. I don't think that's something we should really ever want to be a part of. All right? So all that to say, give you a basic understanding of the popular usage of the term in today. And because of that, I tell you, Christians cannot simply endorse modern social justice. Okay? So if you were to go out there, or like our denomination has been doing and other denominations and churches, if you were to go out there and you were to speak to some guy on the street who's really upset, and you say, Jesus is for social justice, they're going to hear all of that baggage with it. Right? The term used to mean something different, and now means this by most people. So you can't just go out there and say, we agree with you on social justice, because we can't. They're totally different ideologies. Now, if you want to take the terms and say, that's not what actually social justice is, let me tell you what it really is, yeah, you can go ahead and do that. If you're going to use the term in modern parlance, you're going to have to do a lot of work to redefine it, to understand where the tensions are. Otherwise, they're going to hear total godless ideology. I mean, social justice is used for reproductive justice, i.e. abortions. It's used with that reproductive justice, transgender sex change surgeries, taking kids from parents who won't let their kids do that. Social justice is the banner that flies over all of that stuff. And you as a Christian can't go out there and say, yeah, we're for that. You got to find some other way to talk about it. Otherwise, they won't understand. They won't understand how this is different. So, having said all that, and man, I'm really behind. Let's talk a little bit about biblical justice. All right, let's define that. All right, biblical justice. All right, the basis of biblical justice is what I had said to Matt. It is giving someone what they have earned or what they are due. Okay, and this can be worked out in a lot of different ways. For example, if I worked for Kerry, and we had agreed on the fact that he was going to pay me $15 an hour, and I get my paycheck, and Kerry has only paid me $5 an hour. That is an injustice, because we had agreed upon terms, and Kerry violated those terms. Okay? Giving someone their due is that background of justice. It can be applied to a lot of things. Personal rights. Okay? So when you think about our founding fathers writing that you are endowed by your Creator with certain unalienable rights. What that means is you are, as a human being created in the image of God, you are due certain rights. And the government has no right to take from you your due as an image bearer of God. Human rights are tied to justice. Someone's human rights are violated, then, well, you got problems. All right, justice is also this idea of a fitting punishment or acquittal. The innocent should go free. The guilty should be punished. Wages, we already talked about. Property rights as well would fall under that. And you can pull this, the Hebrew word is mishpat. You can pull this from a lot of different things. I think the best example here is Exodus 21. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, or stripe for stripe. Or you can look back into Genesis chapter 9, where God lays out the death penalty for Noah. If anyone kills a man, he shall be killed. Justice is about the due, what you have earned, the merits of an individual case. I've written on this a bunch, but this idea of an eye for an eye has really gotten a bad rap for Christians. We don't really understand what this is about. First, primarily here in Exodus 21, it's given for legal proceedings, right? And it's about this idea that the punishment must fit the crime. We have absolutely zero evidence whatsoever that the Israelites ever, like if someone gouged out someone else's eye, that they actually went out and gouged out that person's eye. It's more of a metaphor than anything else. It's saying that the punishment should fit the crime. And what it does is it limits punishment. If you go back and you read laws from ancient civilizations besides Israel, you will find that the punishment was often cruel and unusual and far exceeded the crime. Right? You steal something, death penalty. Done. Right? You steal a loaf of bread in the marketplace, they chop off your hand. Right? That was common. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth in the Old Testament was to hem in that spirit of vengeance and to make sure that the punishment fit the crime. In fact, if you go back and you look at common law back in England and then here in the United States, they built common law off of the case law in the Old Testament. And this is where we get the idea that cruel and unusual punishment is wrong. You get it from an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Punishment is to fit the crime. So having to understand that, let's just look at a few of these definitions as we talk about this Christian realm here. Okay, what is mercy? Mercy is not receiving your due or punishment that you have earned. So I go before a judge or king or God and I say, give me mercy. I'm telling him to not give me what I owe, my just deserts. Right? Don't give me the thing that I've earned. Don't give me that punishment. Right? Have mercy on me. Grace is receiving good when you have no right to it. It's the free gift of God. For you've been saved by a free gift of God. You have no right or due before God to say, you must save me. Right? It is a free gift from God. And justice is then that again, receiving your due, what you have earned. Okay? So, if you understand this, right, these terms cannot be redefined. They can't be really melded together. All right? If justice is, which it is, receiving your due, and mercy is not receiving your due, how do you put the two together? You can't. Right? They're opposing definitions. This is a simple logic, shouldn't be really that controversial. So those who, and others who seek to redefine justice in this way, to necessarily include mercy, they're just, biblically speaking, they're wrong. Right? That's not what the Bible talks about. We'll keep moving here. We'll have time for questions at the end. So in this, the Bible also gives us standards of justice. What does a just procedure look like? How do we get justice in this life? I'm going to run through this rather quick, but you'll see here a lot of the things, again, that build up our current judicial system. Is our current judicial system perfect? Most certainly not, right? But again, if you go throughout world history and you look at all the other options, we're doing better than just about everybody else. Okay, so first standard of biblical justice is the presumption of innocence. You are presumed innocent. Deuteronomy 19:15. A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. Established means even heard in the court. Right? So, put it away. Another way, we'll pick on Carrie again. If Carrie comes up and accuses me of a crime, the biblical deference is to me, not to him. You presume that I'm innocent until proven otherwise. If it's just a he said, you presume upon the innocence of the party. Okay? This is built in really closely into the next thing, is you need corroborating evidence. All right, Numbers 35:30. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. You can't do it, he says, God says. You can't do it on one witness. You know why? Because people lie. People are mistaken. Sometimes they get it wrong. All right, this is repeated throughout the Bible, again and again and again. All right, same thing, Matthew 18. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, more witnesses, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. This is Jesus speaking. If you want to establish what's going on, you can't just have one person versus another person. You need to have multiple corroborating evidence. Okay, that's where the term comes from in our legal doctrines. 1 Timothy 5:19. Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay? This isn't giving some special elevated status to elders and pastors. It's just applying the law to this situation. If somebody comes up and tells you how terrible I am, they're probably right. But you shouldn't listen to gossip. You can't just take one person's testimony. They might be telling the truth. Sometimes they are telling the truth. But you don't know that yet. Okay? You take the charges seriously, but you don't automatically believe them. That is laid out. I didn't give you all of the biblical examples of this, but there are many, all of the time, over and over again. All right? You have to have 2 or 3 witnesses. Why 2 or 3? All right? Why 2 or 3? Because if the 2 witnesses are me and Emily, there's some conflict of interest there. Of course the husband and wife are going to say the exact same thing, so you might need a third one. You need something independent. And of course today that would include things like physical evidence and all those other things. It's not just witnesses anymore. There's something else to corroborate the charge and the story, just to even consider the charge, for it to be established. Okay? Another thing, as I already talked about, witnesses lie or mistaken. Right? This is in the 10 Commandments. Do not give false testimony against your neighbor. This command is not primarily about lying in general. It's primarily about court. Don't lie in court. Why do you have to tell people that? Because sometimes people lie. Sometimes they're mistaken. Right, next one. Justice is blind. All right, so at the beginning you saw Lady Justice and she has a blindfold over her eyes. Why would justice be blind? Don't you need to see things? Well, the blind means this. All right, Exodus 23, verse 3. Do not show favoritism to a poor person in his lawsuit. Or then in Leviticus 19:15. You must not act unjustly when deciding a case. Do not be partial to the poor or give preference to the rich. Judge your neighbor fairly. So the term impartial here, again, it's used in the New Testament too. The term basically means you don't consider the person's face, who they are. Okay? If I show favoritism in my judgments because, let's be honest here, this happens all the time. If I show preference to someone and I always believe somebody with a D next to his name or always someone with an R next to his name, you're not actually concerned with justice. You're concerned with partiality. You're concerned with your side winning. Right? Justice is impartial to that. You don't get to side with the rich or the poor. You don't get to side with the Republicans or the Democrats all the time. You don't get to side with African Americans all the time or the police all the time. If you already know how you feel about the next one that happens, you don't give a word I can't say about justice because you've already made up your mind, so you don't care. That's an abomination before the Lord. You have to know the facts before you can issue any type of justice. All right. That gets to this next thing. Universal standards. Proverbs 11:1, Numbers 15:16. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. That is, you have one balance, one weight for everything. And then one law and one rule shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you. The law, whatever the law is, applies equally to everybody in the society. You don't get to single out someone because they're a foreigner, an outsider, a minority, or a majority. The law is universal standards for everyone. Also, something we need to remember today, justice requires that you hear both sides before you issue your finding. All right? Proverbs 18:17. The first to state his case seems right until another comes and cross-examines him. Okay? If you've been in ministry for any amount of time, you realize that you always have to hear both sides of the story. Sadly, sometimes after you hear both sides of the story, you still have no idea what's going on. If you've been paying attention at all to social media and modern events, we should realize by now that we need to hear both sides of the story before we get our Twitter or Facebook mob. Right? I mean, honestly, Christians, well-known Christians, have gone out there on social media and have slandered and lied about individuals, and this happens on both sides of the aisle. And they never admit it and never backtrack it later when all the facts come out. All right, so you all know what happened to Nicholas Sandmann with the guy wearing the MAGA hat and then the Native American drummer, which at first when the video came out, it looked really, really bad. But when all the facts came out, it turns out that he singled him out and went up and started doing it. And as I've said before, Nicholas handled it a lot better than I would have as a teenage boy at that time. But there was a very prominent female Christian author, whose some books are in our library, who said as she looked at that young man's face, she saw the eyes of Satan in his eyes. She's never backtracked that. That's deplorable. That's wicked. You can't do that and say you're for justice. Okay? You can see things like this and say, hey, man, I'm really concerned right now, but by now we should realize that you need to hear the other side of the story before you get all worked up in a tizzy, because the problem becomes we issue our verdict and then the facts come out, and because we've already bought in, we won't admit that we were wrong in the first place. We'll try to find any justification. So when we look at some of these police things that have happened, there are several, and I don't keep track of all of them, but there are several that I'm very, very concerned with how the police acted. But there are others that are trumpeted that it's very clear that the police were justified in everything they did. And if we can't admit that when we look at the facts, then I'm sorry, you're not really concerned about justice. Okay? It gets on to the next one. Justice ignores the mob. Again, something we need to remember today. Exodus 23, verse 2. You must not follow a crowd in wrongdoing. Do not testify in a lawsuit and go along with a crowd to pervert justice. Just because everybody's running off that cliff in the name of justice doesn't mean you should either. Justice doesn't care about what the mob wants. Whether that mob was a lynch mob in the 1900s, lynching African Americans in the name of justice, it wasn't justice. Or if it's the mobs roaming our streets today, doing unjust things in the name of justice, right? Mobs generally don't really care about justice. And finally, something we most certainly need to remember. earthly justice is limited. All right, Romans 12:19. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. One of the problems with our secular culture today with justice is they don't have a larger view. If justice doesn't happen in this life, they have no hope that it'll ever happen. So they demand perfect justice now. The Christian worldview recognizes that we're not going to get perfect justice in this life. There are certain benefits to this system that we just laid out, the biblical system of justice, to the accused. Part of the reason of that is if you realize if there isn't a presumption of innocence, and this has happened throughout world history, legal systems become a weapon used by the powerful to oppress just about everybody else. Okay? But Christians recognize that even if the murderer gets away with it in this life, he doesn't get away with it in the end. Okay? God will right every wrong. That doesn't mean we become callous to injustices or that we don't try to do better. We do all of those things, but we recognize that in humans and human systems that it will never be a perfect result. So I'll just try to summarize all of this for you. All right? A just process aims at giving someone their due. All right? The innocent are to go free. The guilty are to receive a fair punishment. And you note by this, right, it's very key to seeing the contrast between biblical and social justice. Biblical justice requires unequal outcomes. It necessitates it because it's based upon the facts and the merits of a case, what you are due. All right? So even in the case law of the Old Testament, you can have two different murders, as it were, and one receives the death penalty and one doesn't, because of the facts around the case, whether it was an intentional homicide or an unintentional homicide. Two different outcomes because of the merits of the case, what actually happened. Biblical justice necessitates that when you judge all the merits, that there will be unequal outcomes based on the merits, not on who the individuals are. All right, the process is to be about facts and finding the truth. It is to be fair and impartial with initial deference given to the accused. Just proceedings must ignore pressure from the mob, politicians, and larger agendas. And that is what biblical justice is all about. I'll wrap it up here and then we'll have time for questions. Why it matters. Okay, why does all of this matter? Okay, so we've talked about what social justice is, how it's been redefined in the church, how it's used in popular culture, and what biblical justice is. And basically it boils down to the fact that ideas have consequences. Right? Ideas matter. Which path we go on will inevitably impact the now and the future. So when we lay out these two different definitions of justice, you see that they're at conflict, they're at odds with one another. In fact, again, if you go deep into their literature, not even that deep, but if you read their literature, they flat out say presumption of innocence, impartial judging is white supremacy and systemically unjust, and it's a way that the powerful and Christians keep the minorities in check. They just flat out say it. And so they acknowledge that the systems that informed and governed our common law at its inception are totally incompatible with the systems they want to put in place. They don't hide it, and I'm not going to hide it from you either. So they recognize that if we really want justice, we have to make a choice. All right, you can't really do both of them. All right? Biblical justice demands every person be treated the same. Social justice, as is most commonly used, demands the exact opposite. All right? Social justice says unequal outcomes are unjust. Biblical justice necessitates unequal outcomes based upon merit, not upon who someone is, not upon their age, race, wealth, or whatever. All right? If, again, why it matters, if social justice is actual justice, then our God is unjust. This is why it matters. Okay? God judges all of us by the same universal standard, and it results in eternal inequities of outcome. Some go to everlasting life, some go to everlasting death. And you don't get more unequal an outcome than that. And that is the end to which God is moving this entire universe. And when he does, Revelation tells us, we will cry out, for he has acted in justice. Right? Moreover, the gospel's glory is shown in God being both just and merciful. Why is the gospel such good news? Well, let's go to Romans 3. Why is this such good news? Paul writes, for there is no distinction, right? There's no partiality, Paul says, between Jew and Gentile. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift. Right? You are made just, or you are made righteous by a gift of God, not by justice, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation, that is, he satisfied God's just wrath or his punishment for sin, by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he passed over former sins. Right? He waited to punish them. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Right? This is the gospel. God satisfies his own justice, and then out of grace saves some, so that God is both just, you can't look at him and say you're not doing what you should be doing, and he's also the justifier, or the one who makes you righteous, or the one who shows mercy. Right? Justice and mercy, two different things, and only really come together at the cross of Jesus Christ. If justice, or if mercy is a part of justice, as people like Tim Keller argue, then there's a sense in which you and I can go before God, even before we were Christians, and say, justice demands you to save me. Because mercy is a part of justice. You have to save me, God. That's the just thing to do. No, it's not. Justice is that you would be punished. But God satisfies his demands of justice and shows mercy to some. So it really does matter in how we understand the core message of the Christian faith. If you blur the lines between the two, everything just becomes muddled nonsense. So why it matters is that the gospel of social justice really is a different gospel. You have to pick the one, or you have to pick the other. And if you do much reading in church history, what tends to happen, in responding to real problems too, what will tend to happen is somebody will get some brilliant idea, they think, to solve these problems, and they'll go too far, but they'll still hold on to a lot of orthodoxy. And you'll be like, brother, I think you're wrong, but I still think you're my brother. And I think that about Tim Keller. But the problem is his theological heirs, or those who inherit it from him, won't. This happens all the time. The one guy takes the one step, and that leads to logical conclusions that the next round takes, and then the next round takes, and as Machen said at the very beginning, you end up with a completely different religion. This Christianity or theological liberalism, they're not the same thing. It really is Christianity or this modern definition of social justice. You have to pick between one or the two. And, well, for me, you know what I'm picking.